Dr. Vex Korrath had developed what his colleagues politely called extinction fatigue, and what he privately termed a pathological hatred of dead civilizations with terrible timing. Standing knee-deep in the crystallized remains of yet another species' final city, he stared at the holographic translation floating above his scanner with the enthusiasm of someone discovering their 15th consecutive parking ticket. "The humans are holding back," he read aloud to the empty ruins of Kepler 442c. "Original, truly groundbreaking. I'm sure no one has ever thought to blame the galaxy's most aggressively helpful species for their problems." The Galactic Archaeological Consortium had a peculiar problem. Every extinct civilization they'd catalogued in the past 3 centuries, all 847 of them, had left behind the exact same final message. Not similar messages, not thematically related warnings. The identical phrase, translated across 847 different languages, writing systems, and communication methods. The Zephyrians had carved it into their moon. The crystalline hegemony had encoded it into their planet's magnetic field. The Void Dancers had somehow woven it into the quantum foam itself before their species winked out of existence. And every single one blamed humanity for holding back. Which was, Vex reflected, while his equipment catalogued another civilization's death throes, absolutely ridiculous. Humans were the galaxy's golden retrievers, enthusiastic, friendly, and constitutionally incapable of leaving anyone alone when they were struggling. They mediated trade disputes, provided disaster relief, shared technology freely, and had never met a diplomatic crisis they couldn't solve with earnest conversation and an alarming amount of caffeine. The Terran Federation maintained embassies on 12,000 worlds, ran humanitarian missions to another 8,000, and had somehow convinced the galaxy's 847 major species to sign the Universal Peace Accords without firing a single shot. They were so relentlessly pleasant that the warrior clans of Vorthek had actually apologized for their entire cultural identity and taken up pottery. Vex's scanner chimed, indicating it had found the civilization's final data cache. The hegemony of Kepler 442c had been a typical mid-tier species. Decent technology, reasonable social structure, and the common sense to avoid picking fights with anyone who could crack planets. They'd died out roughly 400 years ago from what appeared to be a cascading environmental collapse. Nothing unusual there. Plenty of species managed to poison their own biospheres without outside help. But there, encoded in their final transmission array, was the message that had become as predictable as stellar drift. "The humans are holding back. They could have saved us. They chose not to. Beware their kindness. It comes with conditions we never understood." "Dr. Korrath?" The voice belonged to Captain Ezra Blackwood, the human liaison assigned to this particular archaeological expedition. Vex had noticed that humans seem to have liaisons assigned to everything these days, always eager to help, always ready with resources and sympathy and an inexplicable ability to show up exactly when things got interesting. "Captain Blackwood," Vex replied, not bothering to hide his irritation. "Let me guess. You're here to offer assistance with the translation, provide historical context, and express deep regret for another species that humanity apparently failed to save despite their best efforts." Ezra smiled with the kind of practiced warmth that made Vex's scales itch. "Something like that. Though I have to ask, after 847 identical messages, aren't you starting to wonder if there might be a pattern worth investigating?" Vex had been wondering about the pattern for the better part of a decade, which was exactly how long it had taken him to realize that wondering about it publicly was a career-limiting move. The Galactic Archaeological Consortium received significant funding from the Terran Federation, and questioning humanity's role in galactic history had a way of making research grants mysteriously disappear. But Ezra's question hung in the air like a challenge, and Vex had never been particularly good at backing down from challenges. "The pattern," he said carefully, "is that every extinct species seems to have expected more help than they received. It's hardly unusual for dying civilizations to blame their benefactors for not doing enough." Ezra examined the crystallized remains of what had once been a Keplerian cultural center, his expression thoughtful. Though it is interesting how specific they are about the holding back part. Not "humans failed us" or "humans abandoned us." They all seem to think humanity was deliberately restraining itself. Vex pulled up his personal research files, the ones he definitely wasn't supposed to have compiled. The Zephyrians died from a plague that human medical technology could have cured, but the treatment arrived 3 days after their last city fell. The Void Dancers requested military assistance against an asteroid impact that human deflection systems could have prevented, but the paperwork got delayed in committee. The crystalline hegemony needed rare Earth elements that humans had in abundance, but the trade negotiations stalled over minor diplomatic protocols. "Bureaucracy," Ezra said with a shrug. "The universe runs on it. Surely you don't think there's some conspiracy behind administrative delays?" But Vex was already pulling up more data, his academic instincts overriding his survival instincts. The hegemony of Kepler 442c sent 17 requests for environmental assistance over a 50-year period. Each request was acknowledged, processed, and approved by human authorities. The actual aid packages were dispatched with remarkable efficiency. Then, what's the problem? They all arrived approximately 6 months after the ecosystem collapse became irreversible. Vex's voice was getting sharper. Not 6 months late. 6 months after the point of no return. Every single time. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, studying the ruins with the kind of attention that made Vex suddenly aware of how isolated this archaeological site was, how far from any other inhabited systems. "You know," Ezra said eventually, "most species assume that timing like that represents incompetence, bureaucratic inefficiency, the inevitable delays that come with managing a galactic civilization." "Most species," Vex repeated slowly. "The ones that are still alive, anyway." Ezra's smile hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had shifted. They tend to be more understanding about the complexities of interstellar logistics, more willing to work within established systems, more patient with the process. Vex felt his secondary hearts skip a beat. "And the ones that aren't patient?" "Well," Ezra said, gesturing at the crystallized ruins around them, "they leave archaeological sites for people like you to study, along with increasingly dramatic warnings about how humanity could have saved them if we'd really wanted to." The silence stretched between them like a void, filled only by the soft hum of Vex's equipment cataloging the remains of another civilization that had somehow failed humanity's unspoken tests. "The thing about holding back," Ezra continued conversationally, "is that it implies capability. You can't hold back something you don't have, and you don't develop that kind of restraint without a very good reason to use it." Vex's archaeological training had prepared him for many things: deciphering dead languages, reconstructing fallen civilizations, and maintaining professional composure while elbow-deep in ancient burial sites. It had not, however, prepared him for the moment when a species' extinction record transformed from historical tragedy into active threat assessment. "You're saying humanity has been conducting some kind of galactic selection process," Vex said, his voice carefully neutral, "deciding which species deserve to survive based on their willingness to—" "What?" Follow orders? Submit to human authority? Ezra laughed, and the sound was genuinely amused rather than menacing, which somehow made it worse. Authority? Vex, we're not running an empire. Empires are messy, expensive, and they collapse spectacularly. We learned that lesson from watching about 200 other species try it. Then what would you call it? Quality control. Ezra picked up a fragment of Keplerian crystal, examining it with the casual interest of someone browsing a museum gift shop. The galaxy is a competitive environment, limited resources, unlimited ambitions, and a distressing tendency for intelligent species to solve their problems by making them someone else's problems. Left to their own devices, most civilizations either stagnate into irrelevance or expand into threats. Vex felt his academic objectivity crumbling like poorly preserved artifacts. So you eliminate them? We don't eliminate anyone, Ezra corrected with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow student. We simply step back. Stop providing the safety net. Let natural consequences take their course. The Zephyrians' plague was natural consequences? The Zephyrians had been developing biological weapons for 3 centuries. Their plague was a laboratory accident waiting to happen. We could have prevented it, certainly, but then they would have simply created something worse a decade later. Ezra set down the crystal fragment with deliberate care. The Void Dancers were strip mining their asteroid belt without any regard for orbital stability. The crystalline hegemony was poisoning their biosphere to fuel an unsustainable expansion. We didn't cause their problems, Vex. We just stopped solving them. And the criteria for who gets saved and who gets abandoned? Adaptability, long-term thinking, the ability to cooperate without coercion. Ezra's tone remained conversational, as if they were discussing weather patterns rather than species-wide genocide. Civilizations that can learn from their mistakes rather than repeating them with increasing enthusiasm. Species that view other intelligences as partners rather than resources or obstacles. Vex thought about his own people, the Zilithians, and their careful diplomatic traditions, their emphasis on sustainable development, their almost pathological aversion to military conflict. And if a species fails your evaluation, then they join the archaeological record with a warning about how humanity could have saved them, which serves a useful purpose, actually. It encourages the survivors to be more cooperative, more willing to accept human guidance in crisis situations, more grateful for the assistance they do receive. The implications hit Vex like a collapsing excavation site. Every humanitarian mission, every diplomatic intervention, every act of seemingly selfless assistance had been a test. Humanity hadn't been helping struggling civilizations out of altruism. They'd been conducting interviews for galactic citizenship, with extinction as the penalty for failure. The Universal Peace Accords, Vex said slowly. A masterpiece of social engineering, Ezra agreed. Amazing how peaceful the galaxy becomes when all the aggressive species mysteriously die out from natural causes, leaving only the ones that prefer negotiation to conquest. Vex stared at the ruins of Kepler 4422c with new eyes, seeing not the tragic end of a promising civilization, but the discarded application of a species that had failed humanity's entrance exam. The crystallized structures around them weren't monuments to random catastrophe. They were deliberate examples, carefully preserved warnings for anyone smart enough to recognize the pattern. How long? He asked. Since we achieved interstellar travel. About 8,000 years, give or take a few centuries. Ezra spoke with the casual pride of someone discussing a successful long-term investment. It took us a while to perfect the methodology. Early attempts were too obvious. Direct military intervention tends to create martyrs and resistance movements. Much more effective to let species destroy themselves while believing they simply weren't worthy of salvation. The consortium's funding, Vex realized. You've been directing our research, making sure we find these sites, translate these messages. Educational outreach, Ezra confirmed. Nothing teaches proper galactic citizenship like a comprehensive understanding of what happens to poor students. Your people have been exemplary, by the way. The Zilithian response to the extinction records has been exactly what we hoped for. Increased cooperation, reduced territorial ambitions, and a healthy respect for human limitations. Vex felt the weight of his species' survival settling on his shoulders like archaeological sediment. Every Zilithian policy decision, every cultural shift toward pacifism and sustainability, every grateful acceptance of human assistance had been shaped by the fear of joining the extinction records. They hadn't evolved beyond their aggressive instincts. They'd been domesticated by the threat of selective breeding. And now? Vex asked. What happens to archaeologists who figure out the pattern? That depends, Ezra said thoughtfully, on whether they're the kind of people who can appreciate the elegance of a well-designed system or the kind who think the galaxy would be better off with a few more warrior clans of Vorthak running around causing problems. The choice hung between them like a translation algorithm processing an ancient language. Join the conspiracy or join the archaeological record. Vex thought about his research, his career, his species' carefully maintained position in humanity's good graces. He thought about 847 extinct civilizations and their identical final warnings, preserved forever as educational materials for the survivors. The pottery classes, he said suddenly. The warrior clans didn't just apologize for their culture. You redirected their entire civilization. Remarkable what people will do when they believe the alternative is extinction, Ezra agreed. Though I have to say, their ceramic work has improved dramatically. Much more constructive than their previous hobby of ritual conquest. Vex looked around the crystallized ruins one last time, seeing them now as humanity intended. Not a tragedy, but a classroom. A carefully curated museum of failure, designed to teach the galaxy's survivors exactly what happened to species that didn't meet human standards for civilized behavior. I suppose, he said finally, I should update my research notes, correct some misconceptions about the extinction timeline. That would be appreciated, Ezra said with genuine warmth. Accurate historical records are so important for future generations. As they prepared to leave Kepler 442c, Vex reflected on the cosmic irony that would have amused him if it weren't so terrifying. The galaxy's apex predators had convinced everyone they were the prey, and their greatest victims kept thanking them for not trying hard enough to help. Somewhere in the ruins behind them, the hegemony's final warning about humanity holding back would continue broadcasting its message to anyone wise enough to listen and smart enough to learn from it. After all, the best teachers never had to raise their voices. They just made sure their lessons were impossible to forget.